So again, you're here for how nonprofits can contribute to voter safety for free and fair elections. Nonprofit Vote does this webinar series, and we actually do read your surveys that you fill out afterward. And so this is one of the topics that we heard a lot in our surveys that folks wanted to know more information about. They had questions about how to make sure that voters can stay safe at the polls. How can they contribute to that? What are the things that you do if you run into a situation you're not expecting at the polls? How do you ensure that folks are staying safe? That folks are, aware of what's going on, aware of what to look out for, and aware of, things to flag that should not be happening, right? So we wanted to pull this together. I'm really excited about our speakers today, who will give you a really comprehensive view of safety at the polls and what you all as nonprofit leaders can do. Just a couple of housekeeping items here. Please do put your questions and answers in the Q&A box. You should have a little black bar either at the top or the bottom of your screen. And please do put your questions there. We'll have a time at the end of our session where we'll go through those questions and make sure that our speakers have a chance to answer as many questions as possible. But please put your questions there as opposed to putting them in the chat. In the chat, as you can see already, we've got lots of active folks here, and I wouldn't want your questions to get lost in the chat. So please do put them in the Q&A box. And our wonderful, my colleague Jack will go through and sort those out when we get to that time. Also, I want to encourage you to use the react buttons. If you hear something being said that you're really excited about, that you want to send some hearts, some thumbs up, some reactions, it helps us here to just have confirmation that you're listening and you're engaged. And so that is always really helpful. I want to just remind folks also that there will be a recording of this webinar that is sent to you after. It'll be within the next week or so. This recording will also be shared on our YouTube channel, so you can access it after that. You can share it with a colleague. You can, share that information around. We did not have a live captioner today. We will on our next webinar, but we do have captions available via Zoom if that is helpful to you. So this is what our next hour or so looks like. This is your welcome and housekeeping. Welcome, welcome. We're glad that you're here. I'll give a little bit of an overview of Nonprofit Vote, and then I'll introduce our speakers. They will give a little bit of an overview of their organizations and their backgrounds and all of that. And then we'll jump into our speaker discussion, which will be the three of us. And then the Q&A section at the end is where all of your questions that you have put in the Q&A box throughout the webinar, we will then look at those questions and be able to address them at that time. As I say in most webinars here, we are a team of organizers who would not be able to leave you without a call to action. So we have that call to action and ready to go here before we close for the hour. So that's what our time looks like. I'll start us out by just giving a little explanation of who Nonprofit Vote is. So we equip our nation's nonprofits with the tools that you all need to engage your communities in voting. And that is along the whole spectrum, from voter education to voter registration to candidate engagement to GOTV or get out the vote, and then even post-election advocacy. We really believe that normalizing voting and building a culture where voting is normalized and is exciting is an important thing. And we do that with nonprofits specifically because we know that nonprofits are often serving communities that have been left out of certain systems. And in order to have a more inclusive democracy, we need to ensure that those individuals and families that are going to our food banks, that are utilizing domestic violence shelters, those that are, utilizing health clinics and even arts organizations, all kinds of nonprofits. We want to ensure that all of those voices are being heard in our democracy, because our democracy works best when we have all of those folks at the table. And we have our little happy birthday penguin here because Nonprofit Vote happens to be celebrating 20 years of doing this work this year. We started in 2006. So really excited about that. And we have to celebrate there. A little bit about what our work looks like. We have a free resource library that has all kinds of voter engagement tools. It has timelines. It has sample letters for an executive director to send to your staff about voter registration deadlines. We are working on a resource where we will have sample questions for a candidate forum or a candidate survey. All kinds of resources. Please do visit our free resource library. We also run this here, this national webinar series that is free for you all on a variety of topics ranging from how to stay nonpartisan to we had one recently on creative and artistic approaches to voter engagement. The next one after this will be in partnership with National Voter Registration Day, and it'll be about state voter registration drive guides. So please do stay tuned. That one, if you have not registered yet, there is still time to register. It'll be August 5th. So that national webinar series is part of our work. We also have some research-based partner case studies, so stories and examples of organizations doing this work, and you can read those stories and get inspired and get excited to do this work. We also have a Nonprofit Vote blog that explains a lot of the policy issues that have been happening recently. We've got a really great one on the SAVE Act. We've got one on some of the USPS changes that have happened with mail-in voting. We've got one on the recent OMB, or the Office of Management and Budget rule that has happened. I know a lot of you took the action of submitting comments for that, which thank you so much for submitting those. But that blog is a really great resource for up-to-date policy issues or just issues that are impacting nonprofits doing voter engagement. That's a great resource for those kinds of topics. We also do customized trainings for organizations. So if one of those topics is relevant to you, you want to bring us into your organization, please do reach out. Those opportunities, and that link is on our website. And then last but not least, we are the lead managing partner for National Voter Registration Day, which is September 15th this year. It is also not too late to become a community partner for National Voter Registration Day, or NVRD. Becoming a community partner means that you have the opportunity to get, I think one of the best benefits is free swag. There are posters, there are stickers, there's all kinds of stuff that comes to you so that you can engage your community on or around National Voter Registration Day. So please do take that opportunity. And I think Jack is putting some of those links, he's right on time, putting those links in the chat as well. Great. So on to our speakers of the day. I'm so really excited about these two speakers. Again, these topics are really relevant, and we've gotten a lot of questions about this. So we're excited to have them. We have Rana Simmons from Survivors Agenda, who's going to talk to us a little bit about how to keep survivors safe, but also things that apply to any nonprofit across the country. So this will be relevant for all of you. And then we have Catherine Fullenkamp, who is from Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights and the Election Protection Hotline is really what she's here to speak on. Really long title. Sorry if I missed that piece of that. But really the Election Protection Hotline, which I'm sure lots of you are familiar with, the 866 Our Vote number. And so she can really speak to election protection, what it means to make sure that our communities are safe and are ready for the election. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it to Catherine first here, who is going to tell us all about 866 Our Vote.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gwen. Thank you to Gwen and to the Nonprofit Vote team. We're very excited to speak to so many of you who are doing great work in your communities and want to, layer the work you're already doing with this democracy portion. So very excited, and thank you for all the work you're doing in your own issue areas. So I'm Catherine Follenkamp. I am the Election Protection Legal Analyst at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. So, Lawyers Committee is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization formed in 1963 at the request of President John F. Kennedy. Our mission is to mobilize the nation's leading lawyers as agents for change in the civil rights movement. So today, the Lawyers Committee marshals the pro bono resources of the bar to achieve racial justice, fighting inside and outside the courts to ensure that Black people and other people of color have the voice, opportunity, and power to make the promises of our democracy real. So, Lawyers Committee, as part of the Election Protection Coalition, has established a broad nationwide year-round resource, the 866 Our Vote hotline. This is the nation's largest nonpartisan voter helpline. So on the hotline, we provide voters with the accurate, up-to-date, fact-based information and assistance they need to vote successfully and have that vote be counted. So we work as part of a broader coalition of 300 to 400 partners. I see some Legal Women Voters people here. I see some other groups that are part of the coalition that, between the hotline and field efforts, work within communities and then at that national hotline to kind of take in reports of issues, give accurate information, and then do follow-up. Yeah, ACLU, I see you. And then more about the hotline itself. So as part of this coalition effort, we have the hotline that is administered by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. We're year-round. We're staffed by volunteer legal professionals that are trained and supervised by our staff. Then we have legal materials, and that's a large part of what I do, is keeping those up to date. We're constantly, doing research, updating, working with partners to flag issues to us on anything from changes in the law, changes in procedures, to those sort of rapid response situations that people need to know about. Then if we get reports of a bigger issue, we can, kind of alert our local partners on the ground who can then work with officials, work with that voter and try to get the issue addressed right away, same day, so that they can vote. Give you an idea of the scale. If you add up the amount of time we've talked to voters since 2020, it's 16 years of talk time. So, again, we take those reports in, we provide information. It's kind of a two-step process. So I've been very proud to work with the hotline. I've been working as an attorney for voting rights and elections for 2 decades. And I was actually a volunteer on the hotline myself in the 2020 cycle before I joined on staff ahead of the 22 midterms. So thanks so much, and excited to talk with you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Did you want to do
Okay.
this one as well? There you go.
Yeah. There's lots of different ways that voters can reach us. So this is a great resource, no matter what ways your constituents can kind of, prefer. They can call, they can text. We also have assistance in multiple languages. So if you work with people who, would be more comfortable working with somebody and get answers in languages other than English, we do support Spanish, Arabic, and multiple Asian languages with our partners. That's you.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so much. And a lot of these resources also, I just want to encourage folks, these will be sent to you not only in the chat, but in follow-up emails as well. So please do stay tuned for those. Thank you, Catherine. And now I'll pass on to Rana.
Hi, thanks, Gwen. And thanks everybody, excuse me, for being here today. I'm looking through the chat and I'm seeing folks from all across the country. So thanks for spending your time with me. I'm also seeing a few folks, a few old friends. My friend Ian from the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault is here. And I see Camille from National Alliance to End Sexual Violence. So we've got some friends from Me Too here. So thank you everybody for joining. And I'm coming to you from Colorado. So hi to those folks who are here from Fort Collins and Mesa County in the chat. My name is Rana Simmons. I am the director of the Survivor Justice Network. The network is a collective of 25 local, state, national organizations that are all working to end sexual and gender-based violence. The network is anchored by 3 organizations: Me Too International, National Women's Law Center, and Justice for Migrant Women. And that collective works alongside 100 different community partners And the things that we do together are survivor-led research, aligning on a shared policy agenda. So like, what are the things that survivors are actually wanting and asking for? And then we coordinate national civic engagement activities. And that's kind of, I think, how we met, Gwen. That's why I'm here. One of the campaigns that we coordinate is called Survivors Vote, as you can see here. It is essentially a national civic engagement initiative that equips survivors of sexual violence, of gender-based violence, with the voter education resources and state-specific guidance that they need, that we need, in order to vote, to participate in elections, and to engage in civic life without actually compromising our safety to do so. So these are our partners. It took me a minute to get everybody's logo on here today, but as you can see, it's a wide swath of all the different organizations that work within the field, again, at the local, state, and national level. And then where I wanted to kind of set the stage for this talk is a couple numbers, right? There are 168 million women in the United States. About 1 in 5 adult women will experience sexual assault in her lifetime. That's 33 million survivors or voters or votes. And that's just talking about women. So I think part of the reason that I'm here today is to give that perspective. You know, when we have these conversations about how can we have free and fair elections, how can we vote safely, what I'm going to be speaking to today is specifically how do we protect survivor safety, so that those 33 million survivors have the ability to vote, to exercise their constitutional right to vote without risking their safety to do so. And that's it from me, Gwen.
Thank you so much. This is all really crucial work to be happening. And I think some folks may say, why is this, how are these related? And so I want to just tie these together as we move to the next step of our time here, which is our discussion. And we talk a lot at Nonprofit Vote and get a lot of questions about just how to get voters to show up, how to get people to care is often how that is framed. And we, hear about voter apathy and all of that. But I think really what we should be talking about instead of voter apathy is that connection and is safety. Because if you don't feel like it is important to your life to show up to vote, you're not going to show up to vote. If you don't feel safe showing up to vote, if you're worried that your abuser may have access to your address in some way, if you are worried that there may be federal agents that show up to the polls, if you're worried about any of those things, you may be intimidated and prevented from voting because of that intimidation, because of those safety risks, those very real safety risks that exist. And so it's really important for us as nonprofit leaders to do everything we can to ensure that elections are safe, and ensure our communities that there are resources available to them to help ensure that they can show up to the polls, can send in their mail-in ballot with confidence. So that's the kind of framing for our time and our discussion here. The first question that I have for you two is really, I'll set this up with the fact that I know a lot of policies. There's been a lot of rhetoric and then also a lot of policies happening around voting and elections this year. It's really been in the spotlight between the SAVE Act and what is now called the Save America Act, but also has been that same language has been slipped into some other bills, which that impacts voter ID and registration requirements. We also had a Supreme Court case, the Calais case, which impacted the voter, the VRA, the Voting Rights Amendment. So that really changed the way that districts are drawn. And then we had some states that were starting to change their redistricting, starting to initiate that redistricting process. Some of those states in the middle of an election, while the election while people were already voting. So that has happened. We've had some USPS changes around mail-in ballots. And then recently we've had the OMB rule come down that's impacting, or the proposed rule that has been introduced and is really impacting any nonprofits that receive federal funding and impacting their ability to do a lot of things. There are some language around DEI there, but there's also some language around voter registration and organizations' ability to register voters. And that's not even to mention the FBI raids of an Ohio organization doing voter registration and engagement. So there's a lot that has been kind of piled on us this year as far as nonprofits and organizations doing voter engagement. So with all of that, I promise this whole thing is the question, but that context is all part of it, right? So with all of these changes that are happening so rapidly, how are these voting advocates and our audience here today going to cut through the noise and confusion to get people to the polls? And I'll pass it to you, Catherine.
Yes. So
first there, yeah.
Just a few things to cover, right?
Just a few things, yeah.
I would say the top line is continue with the consistent message that our elections are safe and secure. The U.S. does not have a history of violence at the polls. We've occasionally seen some threats like bomb threats, etc., but not actual violence. And officials have a plan in place. They take these threats seriously and they close things down right away. In a lot of states, they then extend the hours at the end of the day so that voters still have that same opportunity to vote. I would also say focus on what the law is now, not what may happen or people are talking about happening but hasn't. The SAVE Act keeps failing for a reason. It's not popular. And the Supreme Court, while they, not what we would have liked in terms of Kelly and redistricting, they have recently upheld those vote by mail grace periods. Also, residential executive orders, speeches, and unsubstantiated fraud claims are not the law. Elections in the US are governed by the states and implemented by local election authorities, usually at the county level. And the federal courts have ruled, and quote, the Constitution assigns no authority to the president over federal election administration. So there's a lot of bluster, there's a lot of talk, but grounding things again in what are the rules in your state and what do you need to know to vote. So really arm voters with the information they need to vote successfully and have that vote counted. And, in terms of federal officials, just know and reinforce that there are laws preventing federal agents, including ICE officials, from patrolling at the polls. And state officials, voting advocates, we're well aware of the concerns. And trust me, there are rapid response plans in place. Our organization has actually dealt with this already. I'm based out of DC, and we had our DC primary recently, and we took in reports of, DC has had a large National Guard presence. And our organization took in reports of National Guards who were, probably not intentionally, but just kind of posting up right next to ballot drop boxes. So we were able to take in those reports, document them, alert our attorneys that we have in-house who worked quickly with the DC Attorney General to get something to their commanding officers and make sure that those guards were removed and that there was a widespread policy in place, and that was notified to all of the guard in DC. So, this works. Reporting and working with the system has been able to work. I would say the other very successful thing to do is really talk to voters about making a plan to vote. If they're concerned about problems at the polls on election day, they have lots of options. Vote by mail is available in 36 states. If they're worried about USPS delays, return times, et cetera, how that might be handled, know that there might be other options to return their ballot, whether that is a drop box or in-person return at their election official office. And also know if in your state the deadline is based on postmark, you actually have the right to go into the post office and ask the postal worker there to postmark the ballot mail for you right there in front of you, so that you know that that is done on the right day. And then also there is early vote in some form in 47 states. That gives voters that real flexibility to find a time that works for them, a day that works for them. And then if there's an issue or a problem, they still have time to address it. When problems arise on election day, it can sometimes be too late. So, and also if there are people out there that can only vote on election day, the more people who can vote early, the easier it's going to be for those election day only voters. So we're a strong proponent on voting early.
I love that. Thank you. Practical things, right? Focus on the laws as they exist right now. Make sure that you're voting early. These are all really practical responses that I think are super helpful. Rana, would you like to respond to that one too? How do we cut through this noise and confusion to get people feeling more confident going to the polls?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything that Catherine talked about, right? Like it's really voter education, just understanding like what exists today, what is real on what day is today? Wednesday. What's real on a Wednesday? Um, and and kind of what I'm thinking about, you know, the ability to vote safely is paramount for survivors, paramount. And so one of the ways, and this is really what I'm going to talk a lot about today, that survivors are able to do that is through enrolling in what's called address confidentiality programs or ACPs. And so it's one thing to be a ACP participant, but then you also register to vote as an ACP voter. And so kind of my piece of this is thinking through what you talked about, Gwen, where there was the proposed USPS rule where it talked about having lists of voters and verification mechanisms. And so the way that that kind of interplays with address confidentiality is that, first of all, if you're enrolled in ACP, then what that means is that you are provided a mailing address that is not your residential address. And so that's the layer of confidentiality to protect from that information becoming public. And now there was no guidance in the USPS rule that talked about how would USPS be able to certify actual mailing addresses of voters if ACP participants don't have their residential address publicly available. So there was no guidance in there. And what the risk was is that if there was no verification mechanism, then potentially ACP voters would not be able to vote because they would not be given their mail-in ballot. So I give that context a little bit cautiously because my real message here is that has been blocked by 2 courts. That is not currently happening. USPS has agreed to comply with the federal court saying you can't do this. And also this rule affected much more than survivors and address confidentiality program participants. But just to kind of like connect everything together, this threat, there was a threat, and it's not happening today. And so different advocacy organizations are monitoring this as it goes through the appeal process to see should that change. But today, the most important thing is for folks to understand what the AC program is, how to register for it, and then connecting with different state agencies, depending on, what state you're in, to understand how ACP participants can register to vote. All of the processes that were in place prior to that executive order and prior to that rule coming out are the exact same processes that are in place today and that are in place headed into the election. And so I'm going to talk a lot more about what those specifics are. But I think just to echo Catherine, at least from that perspective, nothing has changed. Voting is safe. And we just need to understand what's available to be able to communicate that to the folks who are coming to our doors as nonprofits.
Yes, I'm so glad that you emphasize that voting is safe, right? Like these are, it is often difficult to differentiate between the rhetoric and the conversations that are happening versus what is actually law. And I'm with you. I think we've got to make sure that folks understand what the law is today and operate based on that and not based on fear of things, of potential things happening. Another piece that I just had the thought to emphasize here and remind folks of, when you vote, that is, in general, that is public information. And who you voted for is not public information, but the fact that you voted is generally public information. And so that's why many of us get on these lists and we get all of these text messages and emails and all of that stuff, because folks will, campaigns will get those lists of the public voter records and then reach out to you. So programs like the address confidentiality program ensure that, just because I have access to those public voter rolls, I will not necessarily have access to this certain list of people who have registered under the address confidentiality program, so that they are safe from folks who may have done harm in the past and may do harm in the future. So that is something I think a lot of folks don't realize, that that information, whether or not you voted, again, whether or not you voted is public. Who you voted for is not public information. So the next question I have here, which you all have really addressed here, but in addition to the address piece, what are some of the possible safety considerations for someone planning to vote this year? Like, what do they need to be thinking about as they show up to the polls to prepare for that? I can pass to either of you. Rana, if you want to take this one first.
Yeah, I can just keep going. I'm going to keep going with the ACP.
Great.
So I'll reverse engineer it a little bit, right? Because I just talked about the program without actually really defining it or introducing folks to it who may not be familiar. So I'll take this time now to pause and do that. So the address confidentiality program, like I was just talking about, is one of the most important tools that survivors of sexual and gender-based violence have to safely exercise their constitutional right to vote. So what is that program? It is a state-run program that protects survivors' privacy and provides that pathway to be able to vote. Generally, ACP programs provide survivors with a legal substitute address and mail forwarding service. So what that means is that their actual residence is left off of those different lists that Gwen was just talking about, left off of public records, public information. And so, that becomes a challenge when we're talking about voting and districts and what state do you have the right to vote in and what congressional race do you have the right to vote in, and if we can't establish where your residency is, then how do we know that you're voting in the right election, right? That's where a lot of concerns arise when it comes to safety, confidentiality, accuracy. And so what happens is that the agency that runs the address confidentiality program has the residential address, the real address, if you will, of a survivor, but protects that by not releasing that address further. Why is this important? Gwen has already set me up really beautifully to talk about this. But essentially, if you're thinking about a survivor, somebody who's experienced domestic violence, sexual violence, stalking, harassment, human trafficking, right? This is someone who is concerned for their safety, their physical safety, emotional, mental, financial, all of it. And so one of the protections in place is this ACP program. And just to give a little history and context, ACP programs were originally envisioned for domestic violence survivors with the idea that when a survivor of domestic violence leaves flees an intimate partner violent relationship, they're really in a lot of danger. And what happens a lot of the times for folks familiar with this model, you'll hear a lot about power and control, that when a domestic violence relationship is essentially defined by one person in the relationship having more power and control over the other and exercising a variety of tactics to maintain and gain power and control over that person. So if you imagine when a survivor has what they need to be able to leave that relationship, that is a moment where the perpetrator is losing power and control. And so what happens is that lethality escalates, risks escalate. And so there are a variety of things that survivors do. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here right now, because nonprofit folks, you are the ones who put in place the safety plans to make sure that people can leave and stay safe once they're gone. And so ACP is just one of those methods of protecting survivors from perpetrators finding them and that lethality escalating. And so that was originally how these programs came to be. Over time, state legislatures around the country shifted from this relationship-based model, right, focusing specifically on domestic violence, to risk-based models. What does that mean? That means regardless of the relationship to the actual between the perpetrator and the survivor, if there is a risk present, then folks should be afforded protections to stay safe and their families. And so it went from a program specifically for domestic violence survivors, dating violence survivors, to sexual violence, stalking, harassment. And actually, many states have expanded it to reproductive justice, to protect healthcare workers. And some states have gone as far as to protect patients. So anyways, that's kind of the background on why the program came to be. And I think another important element here is that thinking through, like, how are these programs actually enacted throughout the country? In the same way that states run elections, states run ACP programs. So generally speaking, they all have a substitute address and mail forwarding service and allow survivors to register to vote without providing their residential address. But the way that they are implemented varies widely from state to state. So for example, all but Alabama, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming have ACP programs. I'll also say, I'm going to put this in the chat when I'm done talking because I can't do two things at once. I will also say that those states, while they don't have address confidentiality programs, they do have confidential voter options that survivors can explore with the help of folks like you who are registering people to vote. So I'll drop that information in the chat in a minute. So what that means is that every state except for those four, including Washington, D.C., including Puerto Rico, all have address confidentiality programs, all implemented differently. For example, Arkansas, Florida, and Puerto Rico limit their program to only domestic violence and dating violence. All other programs are more expansive. So even your eligibility requirement to get into the program is going to vary widely from state to state. I think the most important piece of this, though, and I'm happy to answer any questions about how to become an ACP participant, is really how do ACP participants then become ACP registered voters? And so, and again, like, I just really feel like I'm in a political home right now. Like I'm speaking to the people who understand this, like when you don't have to say
We
much.
have built a good community of folks who get it. So yeah, I think
Right.
that's really crucial.
Well, the piece around different systems not talking to each other, and who stands in that gap? The people on this call. So to register as an ACP participant, you might be talking to I don't know, the Division of Criminal Justice in your state. You might be talking to the Secretary of State. You might be talking to the Attorney General's office. But those are not the same agencies that run elections. And so what happens is that survivors have to not only know that the program exists and enroll, but then figure out who they need to talk to and advocate for themselves um, to be able to register to vote. And that's where I think this piece around information is so important for us to have because we're the ones who are having that discussion. So I'll stop there and answer any questions that folks might have. Um, but yeah.
Yeah. I think that's so crucial. And yeah, nonprofits are serving folks that are in the gaps, that have like fallen through the gaps often. And so that's getting that information to them is super crucial. Catherine, I'd love to hear from you about how to kind of differentiate between some of these threats and it would be very easy for someone to say, oh, look, it's a black car with tinted windows. Oh no, ICE has showed up to the polls, or whatever that is. And I think a lot of us are on high alert in some ways, depending on where we are and our environment and all that. But how do we begin, even whether this is in person at the polls or online, how do we differentiate between those real threats and perceived threats and misinformation and all that? Can you talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah, I would say that there are way more attempts to spread fear than actual threats to voters. And so definitely use that curious mindset when you're reading about things and use those good media best practices, whether that's making sure am I looking at a first person account, or is someone saying they heard about someone who heard from someone that their cousin's sister's brother at 31 Flavors saw Ferris Bueller? So, and then also look at what the trusted sources are saying. Look for official sources like election authorities, especially your local election authority. 866ourvote.org hotline. There's lots of good groups that are getting information out there. Brennan Center, Election Line, ACLU, League of Women Voters. Also look at the local news, but pay attention to who is repeating rumors or just republishing social media accounts versus whether they actually went down and saw these things themselves. And I will say, if you do see something that uh, you're not sure about, or you're like, oh, well, this is bunk, whatever. Don't amplify the misinformation. You have your own networks. It's important that you don't repost to say, oh, well, this is wrong. That just spreads it more. So stay consistent in your message that voting is safe and secure. Here's what you should do. And I'll drop some good resources in the chat on kind of safety and voting.
Great. Yeah, I know you mentioned like a lot of different organizations there, and there's so many resources. And I think it can be overwhelming sometimes that there's so many different resources, but I really encourage you to, everyone who is on the call, to find those ones that are most relevant to your community and the community that you're serving, and find those ways to make those connections. The last question I want to leave with you all is really what is like one thing nonprofits can do, or what's the most important thing that nonprofits can do in this moment and communicate to their communities that are looking to show up to the polls and show up to vote this year? What should nonprofits have top of mind?
Yeah, I would say that trusted voices are so important right now. And all of you have a community that trusts you and knows the good work you're doing there. So you are such a valuable resource for them to communicate about voting in elections. So spread the word. Voting is safe and secure. Plans and procedures are in place. Use your social media to post and kind of educate members about these issues, and really pivot that conversation from what if to what you can do. Be proactive about getting that information to voters on the concrete steps they can take. Check your registration, especially ahead of voter registration deadlines. You know, Safety at the polls is getting a lot of focus, but voter purges are a much bigger threat to their vote. Make a plan, ways to vote, places to vote. Know if your state requires you to vote at a specific place or if you can use a vote center and you have more options. You know, Help them know where to find good info. Also help them know where they can report problems and get help. It's in there's people to help, there's things to help, whether that's calling in a report to the 866 Vote hotline. There's also ICE Watch hotlines in your either locally or nationally. And then there's, again, those local election authorities.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, Rana,
Yeah, and
what can nonprofits be doing?
same, right? Like,
Yeah.
uh, understand, right? Like I'm thinking about the folks as I was reading through like who's in the room. I'm thinking about the folks that are specifically working with, unhoused populations. I'm thinking obviously anyone who's working at a direct service organization for domestic violence, sexual assault. I'm thinking about what are these different systems that survivors will always encounter, and how do we make sure that those folks are equipped with not just like information and knowledge, but information that is actionable. And so one of the takeaways, in addition to everything that Catherine just said, one of the takeaways that I am hoping folks have leaving here today is understanding that ACP programs exist. They're different in each state, and you are the way. You literally are the vehicle to make sure that survivors are safely able to exercise the right to vote with that information. And I know we're not there yet, but just to preview, Survivors Vote, Survivor Justice Network actually has a library of resources. We call them ACP one-pagers, where essentially one side of the page is talking about what the program is, what are the requirements in your state to register or to enroll, and then on the back side of the page, now that you're enrolled as an ACP participant, how do you enroll as an ACP voter? So that's way too much to get into on this call, but we do have a bank of resources that we're going to send to folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really you all as nonprofit leaders. I see it as your role to have those resources at your fingertips. You don't have to have all of the answers to everything, but hopefully we're equipping you with the lists of resources that you can reference. So if somebody comes to your organization, asks you a question about this, you can say, oh, I was at that webinar. I know at least where to go to get them the information that they need, even if you haven't memorized all of the, ACP laws for each state, which is never the expectation. Not for us, but great. Thank you all so much. This is really helpful, and we've got I know folks have been engaged because there's lots of questions in the chat here. So I'm gonna just go through some of these. I think we'll be able to get to several of the questions. I know we won't be able to get to all of them. So please do, if you have follow-up questions or anything that we don't get to, please do feel free to reach out. But the first question on here, and just because we have gotten this question so often, and I think this one's going to go to you, Catherine. Lots of folks have asked about the threat of ICE agents coming to the polls. This person asked, is that legal? Should that be reported? And if so, how do we report it?
Yes. So the law is clear. Federal law and many state laws on top of that prohibit not only armed federal agents at polling site, but any interference in elections by these officials or private citizens. So there are laws in place prohibiting military or federal officials stationing troops or armed men where elections are held. So if they were to show up, know that your state law in many cases and federal law is on the side of keeping these out. And there are people just ready to litigate and jump to it. So I would, I dropped a resource in the chat there. That's the Brennan Center, How to Prevent Voter Intimidation by Federal Agents at the Polls. The ACLU Know Your Rights guidance also has some excellent guidance on that. So, but what voters can do is see something, say something, report it to election officials, report it to the hotline, report it to a trusted community group. And there are people, attorneys and other people ready to go and ready to take action.
Great. And I learned in a meeting that we had that actually the 866 Our Vote hotline is not just in a lot of different languages, but there's also a text option, right? That you can message. So if you're not in a place to make a phone call, you can text.
Yeah, and a lot of places, there's sometimes rules about what you can do when you're inside the polls or close to the polls. And so you can definitely
Yes.
text, you can web chat through our website, you can WhatsApp, you can Facebook Messenger. There's lots of different ways that you can reach us.
All the things. Are you on Snapchat yet? That's what the kids are on. Maybe
Not that
that's,
one yet, but
yeah, okay.
you never know. We're always trying to improve voter access.
Always innovating, always innovating. I love it. Great. The next question on here we got from folks was this person said, you mentioned postmarked mail. Other platforms have proposed that this method will not be accepted, that all mail ballots received after election day will not be included. Please advise. And I think probably the answer to this one is that it is in the courts right now, and we are waiting to hear some of those answers. But uh, happy to have one of you answer that as well.
Yeah, so the good news is that the US Supreme Court has upheld a Mississippi law that allows election officials to count mail-in ballots that are postmarked by election day but received up to 5 days. And so, this has been in the news a lot, but the Supreme Court has affirmatively upheld the state's rights to make their own laws about ballot receipt.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. This next question is to you, Rana. What are the requirements necessary for meeting the qualifications for the address confidentiality program? Must you have made formal filings with law enforcement?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, the answer is going to depend on your state. I would say if you want to drop your state, I can give you a precise answer. But most states do not require any sort of formal report to law enforcement. Um, Kyle, I will look that up right now and I will get back to you. Most states do not require that formal law enforcement report. They will require a couple different pieces of information. So, for example, they will say you can either submit a law enforcement report or you can talk to a state certified domestic violence or rape crisis center advocate who can say that you've received services here and that you are, in fact, a survivor, which, that's a whole nother conversation. Um, there are pieces around if you have an injunction in place, which is a civil protection order. So that means that you didn't necessarily go through criminal legal talking to law enforcement, but you did go through a civil path. So depending on your state, there are going to be different provisions. And I'm going to look up Ohio right now and drop it in the chat.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's, gosh, I mean, just qualifying, right? So often all of the paperwork kind of gets in the way of folks getting the justice that they need or the resources that they need. So yeah, getting that information out there, ensuring that folks know they have support throughout that process is really crucial. Another person asks here, how would you suggest working with local police or county's state attorney's office to alleviate fear ahead of November? Are there local agencies, local organizations that nonprofits could partner with? I'm picturing, maybe there are events, maybe there's like Know Your Rights sessions that nonprofits could host. Either of you have ideas about that, just partnering with local agencies?
Yeah, I would say, there's groups already doing that work and you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You're all extremely busy. I'm sure I've worked in lots of nonprofits. I know we're very overextended, all of us. And so, just plug into the existing network. If you, kind of do a search on the internet for election protection and then your state, it's likely that you're going to find some of the orgs that are already doing this work and have already built those relationships and are hosting events and doing things that your network and communities can plug into and attend. So, this is the one time that maybe we can be a little lazier, even though we never are as nonprofit workers.
We can rely on our resources and collaboration
Exactly.
is how I would frame that because laziness. We're definitely not
Marshall
lazy.
our resources in the best way because we're all
Absolutely.
doing so much.
Absolutely. It's mutual aid and support in that. Great. I think that's a great note to wrap up our Q&A section on, that collaboration and working together is really key to this work. And we are all safer when we get to know our neighbors and we build relationship, with different organizations and all of that. So I'm gonna leave you with our call to action, which is today really about staying tuned and about looking through the resources that we're going to send your way. So there will be a follow-up email after this webinar that will have the webinar recording and a whole bunch of resources. We also, as a team, are going to be sending out some additional resources that weren't quite ready for this deadline of this webinar today, but we have additional resources on election protection and around what nonprofits can do to ensure to support safe and fair elections. So stay tuned is the first call to action item, because those things will be coming to your email. And then also just spread the word about the address confidentiality programs, spread the word about 866 Our Vote. There's all kinds of resources related to that. Again, as a reminder, there are many different languages that are covered there as well. So please do reach out, utilize the resources that exist in the community, and reach out to us if you have further questions. Please do fill out the survey that will pop up on your screen after you leave the webinar to let us know what other topics would be key for you. And then join us next week for the webinar on state voter registration drive guides. I'll wrap up by saying thank you so much, Rana and Catherine, for your time and your expertise and sharing with us today. We're so grateful. And I know folks got a lot from the session today. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.